Never place these 5 cursed objects in a loved one's grave. The sentence sounds severe, almost scandalous, and it is meant to stop you in your tracks, not because graves are haunted by trinkets, but because grief itself can tempt the living into dangerous confusions about love, loss, and meaning. Beloved, when we stand at the graveside of someone we have cherished, our hearts do not merely ache, they roar. They roar with unanswered questions, with regret, with longing, with the desperate human instinct to hold on just a little longer. And it is precisely there, in that vulnerable space between love and loss, that we are most likely to mistake symbolism for salvation, objects for assurance, and gestures for truth. There exists a sobering reality many pastors hesitate to address, not because it is occult, but because it is human. In grief, we often reach for things to do what only meaning can do. Scripture tells us that our struggle is not against flesh and blood, but against deeper forces. And if we read that wisely, we understand it not as a call to fear invisible enemies, but as a warning against invisible distortions. Physical death, for believers, is not annihilation but transition, not erasure but completion. Yet the living often struggle to accept that sufficiency. We want to add something. We want to secure what we fear might be fragile. And so we are tempted to place objects in graves that are meant to comfort us, but which quietly confess our doubt. Coins or currency, prepared for spiritual transaction, have appeared in burial rituals across cultures, not because the dead need money, but because the living fear scarcity beyond death. It is an ancient anxiety, the belief that provision must be carried across every boundary. Yet to place money in a grave is to suggest, however unconsciously, that abundance does not ultimately come from grace, but from possession. It whispers that even beyond life, one must pay, barter, or earn. The deeper truth is more demanding and more liberating. If Christ is sufficient, then nothing is owed. To bury currency with the dead is not generosity. It is the residue of a worldview where wealth replaces trust, where value is measured by what can be held rather than what can be received. Mirrors or reflective objects with spiritual inscriptions often find their way into graves as symbols of memory or identity. We want the departed to remember themselves, to see themselves, to remain somehow aware of us. But reflection, when clung to too tightly, becomes fixation. The living struggle not because the dead cannot see, but because we cannot let go of being seen. The mirror becomes a confession of unfinished identity, of a life we believe still needs affirmation. Yet the Christian hope insists that identity is not preserved by reflection, but fulfilled by transformation. What we shall be is not a clearer version of what we were, but something completed, something whole. Soil, stones, or natural elements from sacred locations are often placed in graves to anchor the dead to places that matter to them. It feels reverent, even poetic. But there is a subtle danger here as well. Sacred geography can quietly replace sacred trust. We begin to believe that holiness is contained rather than bestowed, that meaning is localized rather than universal. We forget that the earth itself is not holy because of where it came from, but because of who made it. To tie the departed to a location is to suggest that peace is conditional, that rest depends on coordinates rather than promise. Bottles or containers prepared to trap spirits belong more clearly to folklore, yet their presence in burial practices reveals a fear that refuses to die, the fear that something remains unfinished, wandering, unresolved. We fear that grief itself might escape containment, and so we attempt to seal it, capture it, manage it, but grief cannot be trapped, and neither can love. Attempts to contain what must be surrendered only prolong suffering. The gospel does not teach us to bottle spirits. It teaches us to release souls. Even modern technology finds its way into graves now. Phones, devices, recordings, objects meant to connect, to preserve, to keep lines open? We live in an age that cannot imagine disconnection, and so the idea of finality terrifies us. But spiritually charged electronics are not dangerous because of energy or signals. They are dangerous because they reinforce the illusion that presence must be mediated, that love cannot survive without constant contact. They contradict the deeper truth that love, once given, does not require maintenance through devices. It abides because it is real. Now hear this carefully, because this is not about fear, condemnation, or superstition. These objects do not disturb the dead. They reveal the unrest of the living. They do not interfere with divine rest. They expose our resistance to trusting it. God's mercy extends beyond the grave, not because the grave is dangerous, but because the human heart is hesitant. You can pray right now, not to undo some imagined spiritual interference, but to release what you have been holding too tightly. Renounce not objects, but attachments, not symbols, but the fears they represent. Nothing can separate us from love, not life, not death, not height, not depth, not even our confusion at the edge of loss. Death is not the end for believers. It is the final shedding of everything that weighed the soul down. To add objects to a grave is often to add weight to a moment that calls for release. Let our burial practices reflect victory, not anxiety. Let them confess faith, not fear. And here the metaphor widens, because graves are not only in cemeteries. We bury things every day. We bury dreams we did not pursue, relationships we did not repair, callings we postponed until time ran out. We bury parts of ourselves beneath busyness, beneath wealth, beneath the relentless demand to appear successful. We place cursed objects in those graves too: regret, resentment, comparison, fear, hoping they will stay buried and stop troubling us. But buried things do not disappear. They decompose, and decomposition has consequences. Thinking rightly about wealth is part of this same lesson. Money, like grave goods, is often used to manage anxiety about finitude. We accumulate not merely to enjoy, but to insure ourselves against loss, against irrelevance, against mortality itself. We live as though abundance might one day rescue us from the limits of being human. But wealth cannot save what it cannot touch. It can build monuments, but it cannot grant meaning. It can prolong comfort, but it cannot redeem fear. Inner transformation begins when we accept that some things must be let go entirely, not managed, not stored, not sentimentalized. Let go. Moral strength is not the refusal to grieve, but the courage to grieve honestly, to stand at the edge of loss without trying to smuggle something through that does not belong there, to trust that what has been given to God does not need to be guarded by us. Gratitude enters here, unexpectedly. Gratitude for the life that was lived, not because it was perfect, but because it was real. Gratitude for the love that remains, not because it is tangible, but because it is indestructible. Gratitude teaches us to honor without clinging, to remember without imprisoning memory in objects. Redemption follows gratitude like dawn follows night. We discover that nothing essential has been lost. What was never meant to last has ended. What was always meant to endure has not been touched. This is the great reversal of grief, the realization that love outlives presence, that meaning outlives circumstance, that the soul outlives every container we try to build for it. Purpose, then, turns back toward the living. We are still here. And that fact itself carries responsibility. How will we live now, knowing that we cannot take our wealth with us, our devices with us, our mirrors, our symbols, our bargains? We can only take the shape we have become, the kind of person we are when everything else is stripped away. So the warning in the title transforms into an invitation. Never place these 5 cursed objects in a loved one's grave, not because the grave is vulnerable, but because the living are. Do not bury money where trust is required. Do not bury mirrors where identity is fulfilled. Do not bury places where promise is universal. Do not bury containment where surrender is needed. Do not bury connection where love already abides. Let the grave be what it is meant to be, a declaration of finality that makes resurrection meaningful, a silence that makes hope audible, a surrender that makes faith real. When we stop trying to manage death, we finally learn how to live. And perhaps this is the climactic truth that settles over us like a stillness too deep for words. The greatest curse is not placed in graves, but carried in hearts that refuse to release. The greatest blessing is not found in objects, but in trust that dares to let go. Wealth cannot follow us. Symbols cannot secure us. Only love remains. Only meaning endures. So stand at the edge of loss with empty hands. Let them tremble if they must. Empty hands are not a sign of poverty, but of readiness. Readiness to receive what cannot be earned. Readiness to believe that death does not have the final word. Readiness to live a life now that does not need to be supplemented later. Nothing can separate us from love. Not life, not death, not even our fear of letting go. And when that truth finally takes root, the grave loses its power to terrify. Wealth loses its power to deceive. And life itself becomes a sacred trust, lived fully because we know, at last, what is worth carrying and what must finally be laid down. And when those hands finally release what they were never meant to carry, something remarkable happens inside the living. The weight does not simply disappear, it transforms. It becomes gravity. Not the gravity that drags you downward into despair, but the gravity that keeps your feet on the ground, that steadies your voice, that lends seriousness to joy. You begin to sense that life is no longer something to clutch or control, but something to steward until it is time to return it. Grief, once feared as a bottomless pit, reveals itself as a teacher with stern compassion. It teaches you the true scale of things. It exposes the lie that permanence can be purchased, curated, or archived. It strips wealth of its masquerade and leaves it standing plainly as what it is, a temporary trust, useful and even beautiful, but never ultimate. When you stand at a grave, all currencies collapse into silence. The only thing that still speaks is the life that was lived and the love that was given. Everything else fades into irrelevance with startling speed. This realization changes the way you think about accumulation while you are still breathing. You begin to ask a different set of questions. Not, how much can I gather? But, what am I becoming as I gather? Not, what will I leave behind? But what will be left in others because I was here? Wealth, when viewed through the lens of mortality, stops pretending to be a shield and becomes a tool for generosity, a tool for repair, a tool for creating spaces where meaning can grow rather than suffocate. Inner transformation deepens here because the illusion of endless time has been gently but firmly removed. You are no longer tempted to postpone integrity. You understand now that character does not mature automatically with age. It matures with intention. You become less interested in winning arguments and more committed to telling the truth, less eager to impress and more determined to be faithful. The urgency that once drove you begins to soften into purpose. Moral strength, at this stage, is no longer reactive. It does not rise only when threatened. It is proactive, woven into habit. You choose what aligns with life, even when no one would fault you for choosing otherwise. You forgive sooner. You give more freely. You listen longer. These choices do not announce themselves as heroic, but they accumulate into a life that carries quiet authority. Authority not over others, but over oneself. And this authority is strangely gentle. It does not dominate rooms or demand recognition. It creates safety. People feel calmer around you, not because you have answers, but because you are no longer pretending to be invincible. You have faced loss honestly, and it has made you real. In a world addicted to performance, reality is disarming. Gratitude, once an occasional sentiment, becomes a constant orientation. You notice how much you have been given that you did not earn: time, breath, relationships, chances to begin again. Gratitude teaches you to enjoy without clinging. It allows you to hold success lightly and endure failure without collapse. You understand now that joy is not the absence of sorrow, but the refusal to let sorrow have the final word. Redemption, in this light, is no longer a distant theological concept. It is happening now, in how you choose to live after loss. Every act of care redeems a fragment of grief. Every honest conversation redeems a regret. Every generous decision redeems a fear. Nothing is wasted when it is surrendered to meaning. Even death, the great thief, is robbed of its power when it becomes a teacher rather than a tyrant. Purpose clarifies with surprising simplicity. You are here to love well, to steward wisely, to leave behind not objects, but echoes. Echoes of courage, echoes of kindness, echoes of truth spoken when it mattered. The question is no longer what you will place in a grave, but what you will remove from your life while there is still time. What fears will you bury now? What resentments will you lay down? What illusions about wealth, control, and security will you finally release? This is where the living sermon reaches its final ascent. You see that the grave was never the enemy. The enemy was the belief that life could be secured by anything other than meaning. The enemy was the refusal to trust that love is stronger than loss, that faith is stronger than fear, that truth is stronger than time. Once that belief loosens its grip, everything else rearranges itself naturally. You do not need to dramatize death to honor life. You do not need to fear objects to practice faith. You do not need to hoard wealth to prepare for the future. The future is not a vault to be stocked. It is a calling to be answered, and you answer it not with what you own, but with who you are becoming. So live now as someone who knows what cannot be carried beyond the grave. Live as someone who understands that every day is a rehearsal for release. Release of control, release of fear, release of the lie that you are self-sufficient. In that release, you find strength. In that surrender, you find peace. And when your own time comes far from now, we hope you will leave behind no cursed objects, no anxious symbols, no unfinished bargains. You will leave behind something far rarer and far more powerful. A life that told the truth. A life that trusted love more than wealth, meaning more than control, faith more than fear. Nothing can separate us from love. Not life, not death, not even the trembling hands that struggle to let go. And when that truth finally settles into the marrow of your being, you discover that you are no longer afraid of the grave because you have learned how to live. And living, truly living, takes on a gravity that is neither grim nor heavy, but luminous. You begin to feel time differently, not as an enemy racing you toward an end, but as a companion inviting you toward depth. Each day becomes less about extraction and more about cultivation. You are no longer asking what you can get from the hours ahead, but what you can give to them so that they bear fruit. This shift is subtle, yet it reorganizes everything. It changes how you wake, how you work, how you spend, how you rest, how you love. You start to see that the fear surrounding death was never really about death at all. It was about unfinished business, unspoken truths, unlived convictions, hoarded affections. Wealth hoarded not for generosity but for reassurance. Objects clung to not for memory but for control. When the heart learns to finish what matters, while it can apologize, forgiveness, gratitude, courage, the terror loses its edge. Death becomes solemn, yes, but not obscene. It becomes a boundary that gives life its shape rather than a thief that mocks it. And so your thinking about wealth matures into wisdom. You still plan, you still save, you still build, but you do so with open hands. You recognize that money, like breath, is meant to circulate. Held too tightly, it suffocates the soul. Released carelessly, it evaporates. Stewarded wisely, it sustains life beyond your own. You stop asking whether wealth proves your worth and start asking whether it extends your goodness. This question becomes your compass, steady and uncompromising. Inner transformation continues its quiet work, sanding down the sharp edges of pride and fear. You notice how much of your former urgency was fueled by comparison, by the anxiety of measuring yourself against lives you could not see clearly. That anxiety loosens its grip now, because comparison cannot survive in the presence of purpose. When you know what you are for, the noise of what others are doing fades to background. You are no longer late to your life, because you are finally present to it. Moral strength settles into your bones, not the kind that flexes for approval, but the kind that stands when standing costs you something. You tell the truth even when it complicates the story. You choose fidelity even when novelty beckons. You remain generous even when scarcity whispers warnings. This strength does not make you rigid. It makes you trustworthy. Others begin to rely on you not because you are flawless, but because you are faithful. Gratitude becomes the undercurrent of everything. It hums beneath success and steadies you in failure. It reminds you that every good thing, every chance, every relationship, every morning is a gift that did not need to be given. Gratitude does not deny pain. It refuses to let pain define the whole. It teaches you to hold sorrow and joy in the same hands without dropping either. Redemption, now fully awake, reveals itself as the art of turning loss into offering. You offer your grief by letting it soften you rather than harden you. You offer your mistakes by letting them instruct you rather than shame you. You offer your wealth by letting it serve life rather than defend ego. Nothing is wasted when it is placed in the service of meaning. Even the darkest chapters can illuminate the path when they are read honestly. Purpose, at last, becomes unmistakable. It is not hidden in some distant calling or dramatic assignment. It is woven into the way you live now, into the courage to love without guarantees, into the discipline to live simply when excess is available, into the humility to accept help, into the resolve to finish what matters before time runs out. Purpose is not discovered, it is practiced. And here, at the summit of this long reflection, the metaphor completes its work and releases you. The warning about cursed objects in graves dissolves into a truth both simpler and more demanding. Do not place fear where trust belongs. Do not place wealth where love must stand. Do not place symbols where surrender is required. Do not place control where faith must breathe. Let the grave remain empty of bargains and full of hope. Let it testify, not to what you tried to carry beyond life, but to what you learned to release within it. Let your life, now, be free of clutter that weighs down the soul resentments, illusions, hoarded anxieties, postponed courage. Bury those while you are alive. Lay them down today. Stand in the sunlight of this realization and feel how strangely light you are when nothing unnecessary is in your hands. Feel how steady you become when you stop trying to secure eternity with temporary things. Feel how alive you are when you trust that love is stronger than death and meaning stronger than fear. This is the awakening that changes everything without shouting. The awakening that allows you to live richly without worshipping wealth, to grieve deeply without being consumed, to hope fiercely without denial. It is the awakening of a soul that knows what to carry and what to lay down. And when you walk away from this moment back into your day, your work, your relationships, you carry no talismans, no protections, no objects meant to bargain with fate. You carry something far more durable, a life oriented toward truth, a heart trained in release, and a faith that does not need to clutch because it has learned to trust. Nothing can separate you from love. Not life, not death, not loss, not the empty space where something once was. That space, now, is not a void. It is room. room for courage, room for generosity, room for meaning, room to live fully and finally unafraid. And unafraid does not mean untouched. It means honest. It means you no longer anesthetize yourself against the ache that comes with loving something mortal in a world that refuses to stay still. You let the ache speak, because it is not an enemy. It is evidence that you have loved something worth losing. Only shallow lives are spared that pain, and they are spared it because they never truly risked themselves in the first place. You begin to see how much of modern striving is an elaborate attempt to outpace that ache. We accumulate wealth to outrun vulnerability. We curate legacies to outlast impermanence. We gather objects, symbols, accounts, and assurances as if we could barricade ourselves against the one certainty no one escapes. But all that striving does is exhaust the soul. It teaches us to live defensively rather than faithfully. And a defensive life, no matter how well funded, is always smaller than it looks, so you choose another way. You allow wealth to be useful without letting it be ultimate. You allow comfort without letting it sedate you. You allow planning without letting it replace trust. This balance is not achieved once. It is practiced daily, sometimes clumsily, sometimes beautifully, always imperfectly. But the direction is set now. You know where you are going, even when you do not know exactly how you will get there. And that knowledge steadies you in moments that once would have undone you, when grief resurfaces unexpectedly, when reminders arrive without warning, when absence suddenly feels loud. You do not rush to fill the silence with objects or explanations. You sit with it. You let it breathe. You let it remind you that love does not disappear when presence does. It changes form. And changed form is not loss, it is transformation. This transformation reshapes how you measure success while you still have breath. You no longer count only what you can point to. You count what you have repaired, what you have forgiven, what you have finished. You measure wealth not by accumulation, but by circulation, how freely it moved through your hands into the lives of others. You measure strength not by what you control, but by what you released without becoming bitter. Inner transformation, now fully awake, becomes something like a second sight. You can sense when you are drifting toward excess, and you gently correct course. You can sense when fear is disguising itself as wisdom, and you refuse its counsel. You can sense when grief is asking to be honored rather than avoided, and you give it space. This sensitivity is not fragility, it is maturity. Only the numb need constant stimulation. The awake can feel deeply without being overwhelmed. Moral strength expresses itself here as courage to remain human, to remain soft in a world that rewards hardness, to remain generous in a culture that prizes accumulation, to remain truthful when performance would be easier. You accept that this courage will sometimes cost you status, speed, approval, but you also know what it gives you in return: coherence. And coherence is worth more than applause. Gratitude, now woven into your bones, becomes the language you speak most fluently. You thank people sooner, you thank life more often. You thank even the hard seasons, not because they were pleasant, but because they were formative. Gratitude does not romanticize suffering. It redeems it by refusing to let it be meaningless. It insists that nothing endured with integrity is wasted. Redemption continues quietly, redeeming even your fear of death itself. Death no longer looms as an accusation, but stands as a boundary that clarifies what matters. It strips away trivia. It silences excuses. It asks one question with relentless fairness: did you live what you believed, or did you merely believe what was convenient? This question is not cruel. It is clarifying. It invites alignment while there is still time. Purpose, then, stands fully revealed, not as a task to accomplish, but as a way to be present, to be generous, to be faithful, to be brave enough to let go when holding on would deform love, To be wise enough to know that what we place in graves, literal or symbolic, says less about the dead than it does about the living. So let your life now preach what no object ever could. Let it say, without words, that you trusted love more than wealth, truth more than control, meaning more than fear. Let it say that you learned to release what could not follow you so that you could fully inhabit what still remained. And when the day comes far off, in its proper season, when others stand where you once stood, may they feel not the weight of unfinished business, but the strange, steady peace of completion. May they not feel compelled to place symbols of anxiety beside you, because your life will have already spoken clearly enough. It will have said, nothing essential was withheld, nothing necessary was avoided, love was given freely, and faith was trusted fully. That is the inheritance no grave can contain. That is the abundance no market can measure. That is the victory no death can undo. And until that day, you live. You live awake. You live unburdened. You live with empty hands and a full heart. And in that posture, open, honest, unafraid, you finally understand what it means to be rich, what it means to be strong, and what it means to be at peace.